I think we're ready. So heartily welcome to you all to this seminar on the political impact on sanctions, where the main speaker will be Julian Hinz from the Kiel Institute for the World Economy. NUPI, we are lucky to have this joint project funded by the Norwegian Research Council, where when we applied 2 years ago, we wanted to give it a catchy title, so we called it Shocking Times for European Economic Integration, with the acronym Euroshocks. We did not know, we knew about COVID at the time, but we did not know about all the shocks that would be forthcoming. So of course, the current situation has many shocks, so the title seemed to be very foreseeing. So we have this cooperation with London School of Economics, the University of Groningen, and the Kiel Institute for the World Economy over 3 years, ending in 2024, on economic impact on European economic integration of the various shocks, from Brexit to the green transition and COVID and trade wars and the Ukraine war. So, we had a workshop today and yesterday to prepare research in the project and present our work, and we are lucky to have some people who have been able to follow up on the important theme of sanctions. And the Kiel Institute for the World Economy in Kiel is a kind of important institution in Europe for research on international economics and trade. I think a growing role in the recent years. Perhaps you have looked in the media on their support tracker related to the Ukraine war. They have also done important research in the field, so we will hear some about it today. So I give the floor first to Holger Görg, who is a professor of international economics in Kiel, also the president of the institute of about 120 people working in this important field. So he will say a few words first about Kiel's work in the field.
Yes, thank you very much, Arne, and welcome everyone. I won't take very much of your time because my colleague Julian has the much more interesting and important work to present. As Arne already said, we have been here for the last 2 days to start or to take stock of our project on Euroshocks. So we've had shocking times for the last 2 days here in Norway, and we've had also a lot of fun and a lot of exchange of good ideas. So yes, we are from Kiel, which you might know in the north of Germany. So we are the Kiel Institute for the World Economy with researchers working on different aspects of globalization or deglobalization and distractions to the world economy, which unfortunately we've had quite a few in the last 2 and 3 years. So we have a large group at the Institute working, particularly looking at the effect of the current geopolitical disruptions we've had. Ukraine, Russia is but one aspect of this. And here, as Arne said, we have what we call the Ukraine tracker, where we look at support given or pledged by Western governments to the Ukraine, and we see how are they actually fulfilling their promises, who is paying how much, and so on. But we also have looked at the economic effects of sanctions. And here particularly at Russia, but also at other countries, sanctions against Iran, for example. And this is really where I would like to hand over to Julian, who's the expert in this field and who's going to present one of his papers today. Thank you very much.
This seminar is streamed online, so that you are aware of that. We will have the seminar will last for about 1 hour, ending at 2:30, and there will be a Q&A session towards the end. So, Julian, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. So let's wait for the slides. But first, thanks a lot for having me here. It's been a great 1.5 days of academic exchange. So the paper I'm presenting is an academic paper that looks at the impact of sanctions exposure on election impact. So let's see once Epson has started up. So there seems to be some...
Another shock. Yes, we can only ask for your patience for a minute. Okay. Wow. I can ask. Er det en måte å ta det fra intranett, eller? Eller
Excellent. It works. Thank you very much. All right. So thanks for your patience. What I'm presenting is this paper, To Russia with Love, the impact of sanctions on elections. This is joint work with Robert Gold, who's also at the Kiel Institute, and Michele Valsecchi, who was at the New Economic School. He's no longer in Russia. And so we've been working on this for quite some time. So that's we're three economists interested in political economy issues. So obviously I'm very much looking forward to your input also on for example, from political scientists, from practitioners to the overall paper. Please also feel free to just bluntly interrupt. I'm very happy to obviously take questions afterwards, but also just questions, suggestions, just chip in. All right, so I guess most of us here have been following what's going on in the past couple of weeks and months, and there were repeated headlines of like this. So 83% of Russians approve of Putin's actions. There's Putin's support is strong in Russia amid the Ukraine war, and if you have semi-representative opinion polls, they also suggest at least that there's actually quite some support within Russia regarding what's going on right now. And so, if, in a sense, what we're doing in this paper is trying to see whether this is something that could be expected in the face of in this case there's war, but also in the case of sanctions, which was the case already since 2014. And so, why is this relevant? Well, sanctions are a very popular instrument of foreign policy. We're all familiar with the Russia sanctions. There's obviously also the sanctions against Iran. There are sanctions against North Korea. These are sort of the three most prominent sanctions cases. There are sanctions against Myanmar, embargoes and blockades against Gaza and Cuba from varying countries, coalitions. But also what we're doing here is not too different from what has been done during the Trump administration, using trade policy for sort of political objectives in a way, right? So internally, this was sold as this is an economic policy, but it was also very much against, at least the Chinese, if you will, but also against other countries. Interestingly, obviously, these other countries that were hit by Trump tariffs were sort of retaliated, and I'm just putting this on the slides because I find those products funny. The EU retaliated by restricting trade of tobacco, motorcycles, cranberries, and peanut butter, and the Canadians really hit hard with sanctioning inflatable boats. No, but I mean these are funny products, but they have one thing in common, and these are products that are produced in Republican dominated election districts. Okay? So these were strategic products, if you will, that are produced and have at least some economic importance in predominantly Republican districts, and that's why the retaliation products, so to say, were picked like this. Now, sanctions are popular. If you just look at the raw number of sanctions episodes or sanctions policies applied bilaterally, then you see that there's since the end of the Cold War, this has become an increasingly popular instrument to use as means of cursing another country. Now, what we're looking at in this paper is whether this. So, very graphic description of what sanctions and embargoes can look like on the border and their impact on election outcomes, vote shares, and so on. Okay, so this is a picture that was taken on August 31st on the border between Russia and Latvia, where literally trucks were stopped once the Russians had imposed an embargo on certain food and agricultural products, among them peaches. Okay, and so these trucks were stopped. And what do you do with tons of peaches stuck at the border? You unload them. And
2014.
Sorry, this is all, what I'm talking about today is 2014. So that's the sanctions episode that we're looking at. But I guess it has some relevance not only for Russia in 2014, but also to other cases and also to current events. And then you had the presidential elections in Russia 2 years afterwards. You had also Duma elections, and so the question is: do these economic policies, do they have an impact on voting outcomes? Now, elections may be a sort of a funny thing in Russia, but that's something that we'll be discussing, and we think is actually one interesting venue for research here. So the question, has always been, do sanctions really work? And the literature alleges there are two mechanisms for sanctions to work. One would be deterrence, so stopping you from doing, through more or less physical ways, stopping you, continuing to stop you, or stopping to for you to continue what you're doing. That's pretty much part of the policies that are applied at this point in time. So we're restricting trade in certain sensitive products next to central banking sanctions and so on. So that stops the production of certain products in the sanctioned country. The second is the mechanism is more sort of a punishment until the government change in policy. So it's economic punishment that is supposed to lead to sort of a change in the adversary's policy. And there are really two sort of subsets of how this is supposed to work. So the one set is smart sanctions, so targeting individuals, targeting firms that are somewhat close to the center of power in order to influence, for them to influence a change in policy, or broader economic sanctions that effectively work through making the population unhappy, who then demand change. Okay, and so this is pretty much so this is what this channel that is what we're investigating in this paper. And so the question then is, does local sanctions exposure, so for the population to feel sanctions have changed the economic environment, does that lead to any change in voting behavior? So the specific research question, what we're doing in this paper is, do the sanctions against Russia, so bear in mind this is the 2014 sanctions, which are light compared to what's going on right now. Do they have any effect on regime support? And so what we do is we look at the electoral outcomes and sanction exposure. We have ballot box level election data for the past 20 years. And by ballot box, I mean this is 100,000 different places in Russia where people go vote. And we have data for these roughly 100,000 different places. And then we have data for the presidential elections, parliamentary elections, so Duma elections, but also local elections if we want to look into that. We compute a sanctions impact, so what did the sanctions change on the ground? And there it's quite important, we would argue, that you compute this correctly, this effect. There are some very rough ways to do this. I'll go more into this in a moment. But we suggest this method of what we think is to estimate this, to compute the sanction impact correctly, and then we see whether the change in voting behavior is influenced by this sanctions exposure that we compute in the previous step. We have some what would be called placebo checks and robustness checks, and so we can see whether this sanctions exposure would have had any impact on previous elections, which it cannot, right? And so there we would not expect to see any impact of this later sanctions shock on previous elections, so that validates to some degree our results. We have some other robustness checks as well. All right, so to sum up the paper in two maps, this is the sanctions exposure, so this is the sanctions effect of what's happening in Russia post-2014. So there's a quite significant change in exporting behavior in those Russian regions, and we try to see whether there's any association of this change with the change in vote share for Putin. So these are the 100,000 different ballot boxes in Russia. Okay? And so you see there's a wide spatial heterogeneity both in the shock as well as in the outcome variable. Okay. All right, I'm going to give you a brief overview over the related literature. Then I'll walk you through how we compute the sanctions exposure. Then I'll show you the results of our main specification of the results, and a brief overview over what we're working on right now. So this is work in progress, which is why I'm very much looking forward to your comments. What are the mechanisms behind what we find? Okay, and so there's some cool maps and histograms, I think. All right, so we're not the first to think about sanctions and their impact. Obviously, there's quite a literature on the economic impact of sanctions, both in sanctioned countries as well as in sanctioning countries. So sanctions obviously entail costs also for the sanctioning country. And then there's quite a literature on the global trade effects, and Tristan has also worked on this as well. There is some related work on the political impact of economic sanctions. So closely related work is by Alexandra Peva, who also looks at these Russian presidential elections, and she has data on the specific location of sanctioned firms. So she looks at the smart sanctions channel. So there were specific entities that were targeted through sanctions, and so she knows where that location is. She knows where the next polling station is, and she sees that she actually comes to a relatively similar result. So that whenever these firms were impacted, were directly targeted by sanctions, the surrounding area tends to support more Putin than before. In a related work with another co-author, I'm working on the impact in democratic elections. So here we look at French elections. French presidential elections, where actually the stance by the candidates vis-à-vis Russian policy towards Russia has been an issue in elections as well. And so here we find that those places that have been directly hit by the Russian embargo tend to vote more for far-right parties than before. Okay, give you a bit of a context. We're talking about 2014 sanctions that were in response to let's say the first invasion of Russia into Ukraine. You have this turmoil domestic turmoil in Ukraine in late 2013, and then in early 2014 the situation escalates in both in eastern Ukraine and Crimea, and then you have sanctions by the West, meaning European countries, Japan, New Zealand, Australia, and the US and Canada. And so the first round of sanctions were smart sanctions, so they targeted individuals, certain entities, and were essentially travel bans and asset freezes. Towards the summer, the situation escalates further, and then you have these tougher economic sanctions imposed by Western countries on the Russian Federation, who in response then enact this embargo on certain agricultural and food products. And so what we're looking at is the economic impact of these sanctions, and then try to relate that to the change in voting behavior of these elections that happened before and after the imposition of sanctions. Now, sanctions exposure. So essentially what we're doing is we try to think of a way to quantify the lost trade. So because of sanctions, sanctions reduce these bilateral sanctions had an impact on how Russian firms could trade with European counterparts, with other counterparts, other sanctioning countries' counterparts. At the same time, it also most likely led to Russian firms, then finding different partner firms in other countries, right? So if it's more difficult now to export from your Russian firm to say Germany, to Norway, well, you're still producing, still know how to produce this stuff, so there may be a chance that you find new partners in, let's say, India and Brazil. So sanctions generate this lost trade, but it's important to think about how much the impact really is in terms of what's just lost market share with respect to Russia, and what's the overall general impact on trade. And so the idea is that using a gravity model of international trade, we predict flows for a world post-2014 without sanctions. And then we compute the difference between the observed flows, so those with sanctions, and the predicted flows for a world without sanctions. And so the difference in the total flows is then due to due to sanctions. Okay? And so it's a general equilibrium, a counterfactual, meaning it takes into account both this trade diversion that I just mentioned, right? So that Russian firm may now be, before it traded with that German firm, and now there's a chance that at least parts of what it had been trading with that German firm is diverting now to an Indian firm or that Brazilian firm or that firm in Kazakhstan, right? So there's trade diversion. Same thing happens obviously on the other side as well. So that German firm that previously imported certain inputs from Russia is now importing its inputs from other places. So that's a general equilibrium impact, as a trade economist would say. So there's trade diversion in this respect. There's also, to compute a so-called full general equilibrium effect, you need to take into account that overall it now got more expensive, more difficult for that Russian firm to trade, right? Before it used to, without sanctions, it used to trade with a German firm. Now it's not doing that anymore. Now it needs to find another place to trade with. So it's overall it's gotten a little bit more difficult to sell its stuff, maybe to import some stuff. So the general equilibrium effect on production and expenditure is also factored into this model. Overall, once we estimate this, and once we predict these flows without sanctions, we take the difference in the predicted versus observed flows. We see that there's a 7.4% predicted decline in predicted exports over the medium to short to medium run of total exports from the Russian Federation to the world. Okay? And so. Essentially, how this works is that you try to decompose bilateral flow. So the X here are exports from the origin to the destination at a time t. You decompose that into something that's origin time specific, destination time specific, and then this bilateral component. And sanctions are, as we assume here, a bilateral part of this bilateral component. And so we estimate these three parts separately, and then we plug in effectively for the post-sanction time the pre-sanctioned bilateral friction. So essentially we let the world continue in 2014, 2015, except for pretending as though it was just as easy to trade as it was before the sanctions. And then we can recompute what the flows, global flows between all countries and regions would have been without sanctions. Okay, so we get predicted flows, and we see the observed flows, which are the ones with sanctions. I'm very happy to go into more detail here. Technical detail. Okay. Now we have trade data from every country in the world and every region of Russia. So these are the subjects of Russia, they're technically called. And so I believe it's 84 at this point in time. And so we have monthly trade data for all countries in the world, as well as those Russian regions between 2012 and 2015. And so we have the pre-sanction period, that's 2012, 2013, and then sanctions start in early 2014, continue in 2015. And so we pretend as though the years 2012, 2013 never ended in terms of the bilateral difficulty of trading globally. Okay, so I think I just said that. And so let me show you what this looks like. Now I've been talking through this a couple times. So these are Russian exports to Poland and Turkey. And so at this time, Poland is the one that has these bilateral sanctions with Russia. And so before 2014, before these three different, so we have three different cutoffs essentially when things happen. Before you see that the solid line, which are the observed exports for Turkey and Poland, with Russia with Turkey and Poland, are very close to the predicted flows here, which are the dashed lines. Okay, so our model predicts these dashed. So the dashed line is the prediction of our model of what trade would be in this case. And then what you see post 2014 is that for Turkey, where there were no bilateral sanctions at that point in time, the blue solid line still tracks the blue dashed line pretty well. Okay, so we're quite close to the prediction observed and predicted flows post 2014 from Russia to Turkey are still pretty close. They're not for exports to Poland, which is one of the sanctioning countries. Okay, so here you see that the dashed line is far above the observed line. So the actual exports from Russia to Poland were far below what they would have been without sanctions. Okay, and so the difference here, that's the overall trade loss due to sanctions. Okay, and so you see that other things are happening in Russia in 2015 because there's a clear, so there's a downward trend in total exports from Russia to even non-sanctioned countries like Turkey. But the model picks this up because even the prediction is going down in these for this time period. Okay, so the oil price collapsed in early 2015. There were some problems with the ruble, and so this is picked up. This obviously affects all countries, or Russian exports to all countries outside of Russia, and so this is picked up by the model. Now, the difference here between the observed and predicted flows for trade with sanctioning countries, that's our shock. Okay, that's a sanctions exposure, that's a sanctions shock that's affecting Russian regions that is really due to the shock. The general decline is not due to the sanctions, and that's picked up by the model. But what is due to the sanctions is the difference between the predicted and the solid predicted and observed flows. Okay? And so effectively what we're then doing is we take this difference, we sum this across all possible exporting countries, and we have this by region, and so that gives you then the shock. Okay, so this is the sum of the difference between predicted and actual flows divided by possible predicted flows for that region, and that's the treatment shock. Okay, I showed you this plot before, so that's the sanctions exposure of exports, and what you see is that those regions in the West that have been exporting quite a bit or have historically strong trade relations with EU countries that are, or European countries that are here, are far more affected than those regions of Russia that are, for example, close to China. So some even here had a positive, let's say, positive trade shock in the sense that there was trade diversion. There was more trade with China than there used to be before. So this gives us hope that we're actually really picking up what's going on, because obviously those places that have been trading a lot, or had been trading a lot with Western countries, should be the ones that are more affected by the sanctions, right? So, and that's what's going on. Okay, so you see there's a big spatial heterogeneity in sanctions exposure. Some places, some regions are far more affected than others. Okay, we can also compute the same thing on the import side. It also got more difficult for firms in Russia to import from Western countries, and comparatively easier from regions closer to China. Okay? But I mean, you see how similar there's hardly any difference in the impact. Yes, there's no there's no correlation between this export shock and the level of exports, so that's good news. Okay, so it's really about, you know, who have you traded with before. All right. So let's put this together with the sanctions. With the election data. And so what data am I talking about? This is the official election data from the Russian Election Commission. So effectively, we scraped the server of the Russian Election Commission. It's accessible data. It's transparent. It's not very accessible. There are hundreds and thousands of different drop downs to get to all the results, but it's there. Okay, and so we scraped the whole thing, all elections since 1998, and it's 99,000 different places in Russia for which we have both a geolocation as well as the local election results. In addition, we have some quite rich information on for local elections, regional elections, who's running. We're not using that data yet, but this is also some interesting thing that one could explore. And just to give you an idea of what this looks like, so if you map the election turnout, so we had this discussion over lunch whether you could also possibly see something in the turnout. Yes, so we also have data on turnout, and you see that there's quite some heterogeneity, spatial differences in the turnout in the 2018 2018, I think that's the Duma elections. Okay. So the green here is a very high turnout, and the red is a relatively low turnout. This is the share for Putin in those elections, in the 2018 election, and so again you see lots of green stuff. But I'll talk more about this in a moment. And so the idea is that we relate. Maybe one interesting thing about this spatial distribution of support for Putin is that, check this out. So it's here in the Far East, Putin's support is actually comparatively low, whereas the support for Grudinin, he's the communist, or was the old communist guy, is much higher here. So in those Far Eastern parts, the communist candidate has more support than Putin. I think that's an interesting factoid. Sobchak in 2018 was sort of seen as a potential opposition figure, and so she did get quite some share, some 20% or 18% or so, in some suburbs of St. Petersburg and Moscow. She was not relevant in pretty much the rest of Russia. Now, so this is the election data that we have, and now our estimation strategy is relatively simple in the sense that we take so our left-hand side variable is either the turnout, the vote share for Putin, Grudinin, or another opposition candidate, and we contrast this value in 2018 to the one in the previous election in 2012. So it's the change in vote share that we're interested in. Okay, so that should take care of issues. For example, it's a place that has always supported the regime. Okay, so that should have driven the results in both 2012 as well as in 2018. So that shouldn't matter for our estimation here. So it's really about the change in support or in turnout for the candidate. The treatment, as I said before, that's our shock. That's the sanctions exposure. So effectively, it's the change in or the relative difference in expected exports versus actual exports or imports. Same or similar story. And then we include a number of control variables. So population figures or certain information on population, demographics, things like changes in unemployment, economic structure, and so on. So to make sure that that's not what's driving the result, that it's really driven by the treatment here. Now, one more word on the left-hand side variable. So when we do this or show you results for the presidential and the Duma elections here, and so we have sort of the regime, which is Putin, Medvedev, and United Russia. That's sort of support for if you vote for them. Sort of support for regime. Then we have these loyal, liberal, communist. So different classifications for different parties and candidates. And so what we're really interested in is to see what's the impact on regime candidates in this case. Okay? And so what we find, to get you to the results, is that there's a significant positive impact of sanctions exposure on support for the regime, either regime candidate or regime party. Okay, so what does this mean? That places that have had a higher exposure to sanctions vote more for Putin, not only vote for Putin, but vote more compared to the previous election when there were no sanctions yet. Okay? And so that political scientists have coined the phrase rally around the flag effect. So there's perceived outside threat, and then you're supporting sort of your candidate in a way. Okay? And so this effect is very robust to different specifications. So this is sort of a standard with some very basic control variables. We can throw in more demographic indicators, everything different as well, of course, industry structure, changes in industry structure, and so on. How should I read this effect? So our treatment variable is a continuous variable. It's not a 0-1 dummy. So effectively, what this this number means, if you look at the mean size of the effect, is that 1 standard deviation increase in the shock can explain about 29% of the change in votes in that location. Okay, so it's a substantial. You can think of this as the sanctions impact can explain 30%, roughly 30% of the change in vote share between the 2012 and 2018 election. Okay, so it's a sizable share of that change can be attributed to sanctions. Now we can also look at what happened to these other left-hand side variables, as you would call them. So there was essentially zero impact on turnout. So it's not what's driving these results. It could be that everyone else who usually would have supported the opposition just stayed home. That's not the case. There's not much going on for any other candidates except for the communists and the nationals. And so it seems that the people that voted for these candidates before now moved to support the regime. Okay? And so bear in mind, this is not levels that we're interested in. It's the change in vote share between the 2012 and 2018 election. Okay, so these changed, and the change in who votes for whom between 2012 and 2018, that can be explained, a large share of that can be explained by a sanctions exposure. We have some, you can call this robustness, heterogeneity. So without the cities, so without the big cities, we can check whether there's any difference, any stark difference between be it the presidential election or the parliamentary election. And again, the results are quite similar. We also ran numerous placebo checks. What's a placebo? The idea is that you find something a setting that's comparable, but that should not see any effect. And so here what we do is we see whether the sanctions exposure had any impact on the previous election, change in the previous election. So did the sanction exposure that was experienced post 2014, did that have any impact on the difference in voting behavior between the 2007, 2008 and 2011, 2012 elections? Should not have had, right? And our results show just that there's no impact here. There cannot be, and there is not, so we're not picking up any spurious long-term trends here. Okay, so I think I have 15 minutes left, so I'm going to show you briefly what we're working on right now. And those are the channels. Why did we see this? Okay, and so the most straightforward could be it's really people that change their minds, and that's what at least parts of the political science literature would argue is that there exists sort of this rally around the flag effect. It's sort of a psychological effect that you feel threatened from outside, and then you sort of close the ranks. It could also be that Putin and people around him sort of ran similar sanctions exposure computations as we did, and saw where the impact, or maybe they just asked around, where the impact actually was felt, and did strategic campaigning in those places, or campaigning in the sense of spending money in those places. So, in effect, paving a nice new road, building new kindergartens, and so on, or selective election fraud. Okay, so it could be that, again, they know where these sanctions hit hard, and that's where they try to play with the vote. Why do I mention that? Well, when we looked at the election data, you see some funny stuff. Okay, so this is turnout on the left-hand side and vote share for Putin on the right-hand side. And so these look like relatively nice distributions here. Okay, it's a histogram, meaning it's the vote share for Putin in percent, and how often in those 100,000 ballot boxes that this number turns up. Same thing for the turnout. Okay, and so they look pretty smooth here. This looks quite nice, except for, you see those bars here. Can you see them from back there? So it's exactly 100%. This is exactly 95%. This is exactly 90%. This here is exactly 80%. This is exactly 75%. There's no reason why, if there are vote casts and 422 people cast their vote, then you should be hitting exactly 90%, right? So that's very odd coincidence, especially if this happens in quite a number of places, right? So this looks like there's some tinkering with results, or maybe they were predetermined in a way, right? Or selective, at least selective filling in forms of how many people voted for this candidate, or even turnout, right? Again, here you see exactly 100, 95, 90, 85, 80. So someone said, we had 379 people voting here. Okay? But it's, these are suspicious numbers, and it's unusual that they turn up so often in the data. They shouldn't. It should be just a smooth, relatively smooth, tiny bit of noise in the data, but there's no specific reason why it's at exactly 80%, exactly 90%. Okay? So the question could be, was there some selective election fraud going on? So we're in places that were, maybe the population really was quite unhappy in those places, and some election official then said, well, this is unacceptable, I'm just going to put 90%. Okay? So this could be the case. And so what's interesting as well is that, this is not the case for the other candidates. So this is Grudinin vote share. As I said, so there are a couple places where he's quite high. He was quite high. I think he died. But you don't see any. I mean, there's a little bit here at the 20%, but that's sort of the only spike, unusual spike that you see. For Sobchak, there's hardly anything, right? So you only have these funny spikes in the turnout and in the support for Putin. So the question is, does that, is that in the places where we see high sanctions exposure, we can pinpoint those even numbers or round numbers, as you could call them, right? So if you go back and forth, so you see the black locations here are the ones with the funny round numbers, and I don't have a same thing for Putin. So this was for turnout. This is for interesting support patterns for Putin. But what comes out of the regressions, this is not what's going on. So these these are funny numbers, but they were just as funny in 2012. There's no structural relationship between sanctions exposure and the occurrence of these interesting round numbers in the change between 2012 and 2018. Okay, so it's a bit of a tour de force here. Sorry for that. I hope you followed the main points. And so the idea is that economic sanctions do have an effect, right? So we know that they reduce So there are many effects, but the one that we're interested in here is that they reduced sanctioned countries' ability to trade, for economic exchange, but they do not necessarily reach the goal of changing, at least in that short run, or maybe with the sort of these lighter sanctions, the mindsets of the population. Okay, so sanctions do cause an increase in support for the ruling regime in this case, but I think we can learn some general lessons here because we're using the variation within the country. We're not comparing across countries. So within country, we can say that those places that have had higher exposure to sanctions are the ones that also tend to vote more for Putin than before. Okay, so this is work in progress. Very much looking forward to your questions, comments, suggestions now.
Okay. So thank you very much, Julian. So in these times of uncertainty, it's very good to have people who work thoroughly through the data. So thanks for this contribution. On sanctions, we can take 10-15 minutes with the comments, questions. Waiting for those, I can ask with a question I asked you over lunch, if the support for Putin was mainly at the expense of the Communist Party. Did it actually change Russia's policies with respect to Ukraine? I mean, what is the overall impact? Do you have any kind of considerations on this?
Yeah, as we said, so first, this is for the 2014 round of sanctions, right? So I think that's important to keep in mind that today's sanctions are an order of magnitude, I'd say, harder. So I'm not entirely sure whether we would expect, say, a linear effect that you could could scale to today's events. But your question was referring to the impact on the other candidates as well, right? So did we sort of just see a shift from one bloc to another? In a way, yes, but also in a way, so it was from nationalists and communists to the sort of regime, but still it's likely not what you would want to see, right? Even if you were to block them together, then you wouldn't see much of a change. Ideally, I think what policymakers would like to see is that, you know, sanctions do have an effect on what the population thinks about regime. So that's my take on this.
Okay, we have a question there. Can we get the microphone? And please state your name also.
My name is Kiel Institute. I'm here as a private citizen, so to say. One mechanism of sanctions, as you started to say, is deterrence. Based on your research now on the 214 sanctions, can we say that they didn't have any effect on deterrence when we see what happened now in 2022? So,
you know, I think what we're looking at here is variation within Russia, and so we're looking at a very specific. We have a very specific research question: Do these sanctions change anything in the support for the ruling regime? And I think we're quite confident in that. You know, we show here that this is not necessarily the case. The other thing is, we're investigating this second mechanism of, you know, change in minds, so to say, and that does not seem to be the case. Whereas, you know, you're asking if we see anything on the mechanism of deterrence. This is not something that we're looking into in this case. But I think also, you know, you need to think of economists. I think the one thing that economists are good at doing is thinking of counterfactuals. So what would the world have looked like without these sanctions? I'm not sure whether we can easily say they didn't do anything, because we don't exactly know what the world would have looked like if we had not imposed sanctions in 2014. You know, economics, I think, gives us these nice toolkits in our case to describe economic interactions, and there we can construct these counterfactual worlds, which is what we use here. But I'm not sure whether, you know, I wouldn't be as optimistic as to say that we can do this for, you know, simulate world politics with our equations. So I'd be a bit more hesitant to make any statements on that.
Yes, thank you. I think could I ask a question on the on the political regimes of countries? So you are studying Russia in 2014, which was perhaps less repressive than Russia today, where we have seen protests. So of course, if there was an open dialogue with debates, etc., elections are affected. And you are also studying the impact, the political attitudes to sanctions in the West. How do you consider how you should take into account these differences in regimes?
I think that comes, so that's one of the other channels that we're investigating right now. So is messaging important? And I think my feeling is it is very much. So if there is hardly any media that can say, no, this is not necessarily the West's fault, this is, we should look at our own doing, then maybe those results would look in reality would look quite different. So we have this other project, I mentioned this briefly in the beginning with another co-author, where we look at the impact of these counter sanctions, the Russian embargo, on so exposure to this embargo on election results in France. And so I'd argue that French elections are orders of magnitude fairer than those in Russia. So these are actual free democratic elections. And so what we see there is, we had candidates in these French elections that have openly said, we need to change our policy towards Russia. We need to get rid of sanctions against Russia. Then they will lift the embargo against us. And so in places that had previously had a high share of their exports of these embargoed products going to Russia, meaning they were, at least in part, affected by this Russian embargo, we do see that those places tend to favor more, it's a very similar estimation strategy, tend to favor more the far-right vote, who were proclaiming these, or saying we should change our Russia policy than they used before. So this, for us, this is a sign that yes, so the signaling, this messaging around sanctions is quite important to sort of make clear who is to blame, but that obviously is only possible with free media, free rights of expression.
Another question over there.
Hi, Vicky Buckingham from the British Embassy. You talked a little bit about the impact of sanctions on Russian regions and then the effect on voting. To what extent did you study the voting population's perception of impact of sanctions? Is it that they were fully aware of the impact but believed it was the West's fault, or there was a sort of masking of the impact in any case?
Yeah, so the way we measure it here is purely by looking at the election data. So we don't have the means, and right now we wouldn't have the possibility to actually ask people on the ground, you know, how is it that you do this? There are some opinion polls. So Gallup has these takes questions on, you know, what's your opinion on this country, on you know, how do you see the US, especially how do you see the European Union? So that's something that we're investigating to sort of make. I mean, that's part of this, you know, the channel of individual choice of choosing to vote more for Putin than others, and see whether we find anything in these opinion polls that suggests that really this is going on, that it's sort of an honest switch to vote more for Putin, because also at the same time maybe the support for, or the view of Western countries goes down in those places. But that's work in progress. But it's obviously, you know, that's the interesting part, I think, that's still missing, this mechanism of why we see these results.
Okay, room for one more. Yes, please.
Thank you. My name is Lars Ramplov from our company called DNV. Thank you very much for an interesting presentation. Your data is rather short-term between the sanctions introduced and the voting. Do you have an opportunity to look at later elections to see whether changes might be different in the longer term, or is that beyond the scope of the data you have available?
No, that's a good question. So we do have data up until now, pretty much for elections. Same for the trade data. So the Russians stopped reporting trade data at the end of January of this year. So there's no more Russian trade data available. But up until that point in time, we do have the data, and so we could replicate the analysis, say, for the following election. The thing is that what we expect is that, you know, there's this short-term dramatic change, and, you know, suddenly we cannot export to this place anymore, and then we change our ways of producing, exporting over time. So I'm not entirely sure whether we would, in the, you know, correlating later trade data with later elections, whether there would be much more, whether we would see much, because I think, you know, these changes, my understanding of this is that these happen rather in, you know, shorter notice. What one could do is see whether this shock in 2014, 2015 had any lasting impact on when we difference, let's say, the latest elections a couple of years ago against the 2012 elections, whether we still see the same pattern. So that would be an interesting thing to do, which we haven't done yet. No.
Okay, so I think we are at the end of the seminar. So thank you very much to Julian, and thanks to our colleagues from Kiel, Groningen, and LSE who have joined this workshop. So sanctions will be one of the themes and one of the types of shocks that we will examine in this project until 2024. So maybe there will be new events here in the future on this and other relevant shocks to the European integration. So thank you very much, Julian.
Thank you.